Welcome to the office. Today, we're going to, as we usually do, answer some questions. I got some good ones today. I say that every week. I say that every single week. It's true though. Like none of you have. I haven't gotten any crappy questions whatsoever. Like not even one. It's kind of miraculous. I expected, when I started the show, I was like, nah, I'm gonna get some crap questions. It's gonna be like, how do I make a barbarian with more hit points? It's a fine question, but not for me. So, anyway, office hours. We're gonna answer 3 questions from you, my dear viewers and listeners, about how to be a game master, or storyteller, or narrator, or judge, or hollyhock god, or whatever you want to call yourself. You're welcome here, and we're going to answer these questions for you. So I want to get right down to it because there's some complex ones. I feel like this episode we got some deep stuff to get into. Also, y'all were verbose this time around, so we'll give ourselves lots of room to explore together, shall we? We're going to start with a familiar voice here in the Math Squad.
Hello, Adam. I was wondering about creating mechanics for cinematic conflict resolution. Now, it's been a difficult one to balance for me because on one hand, you want to allow people freedom, right? That's what the whole cinematic thing is about. Allowing them to be as open and creative as possible with the way they describe things or the situations they create, but at the same time have compelling mechanical decision making, perhaps. What I was thinking about for this was stuff like anime, manga, action stuff. It's all well and good to have set initiative orders and combat grids for certain games like D&D, but if I was looking to emulate something more free-flowing, what would you suggest looking at in terms of conflict resolution mechanics, or how would you go about designing one to fit to spec? Thank you.
Well, Dave, my dear friend, I think this is a thing that a lot of GMs struggle with. I think this is probably a common problem. And it's not just a GM problem. I think that we all crave compelling narrative, don't we? Even when we're playing a very mechanically oriented game, mechanics first game like 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the narrative of what does my character do and what does that look like in my mind's eye is a big important one. This is you're hitting on the kind of crucial thing of what role playing really fundamentally is, right? Because as Vincent Baker would say, role playing is a conversation, and you don't want to be having a boring conversation, right? So I think we want scenes, especially action scenes, to be more dramatic, to be exciting. We want them to pop. And that's a natural urge. It's a natural thing to want, right? And as we get exposed to more and more dramatic and sort of explosive forms of media, we tend to want to emulate that media. We've talked a lot about taking inspiration from sources of media in the world, like movies, TV shows, that kind of thing. But really, media has kind of amped its game up even since the 70s, right? Like, we have available to us these kind of broad, sweeping, high cost, high value, high explosion pieces of media that tie quite closely to the origins of most tabletop role-playing games. And so we're really standing up against more and more difficult stuff when we're narrating what our characters are doing, what the worlds that we're playing them in are like. And also to that end, I think most role-playing games are action-oriented, right? They're about sword fighting or laser pistol dueling or running or jumping or whatever, and that's the kind of language that we want to use when we describe our characters doing things. And tension starts to emerge, and this is the bad kind of tension, not the good, what's going to happen to me kind of tension. This is the kind that feels frustrating and annoying when we as a GM or we as players say, my character does this cool thing, and the rules or the other players, especially the GM, says, yeah, actually, your character does not do the cool thing. Your character does a different thing that's embarrassing and shitty. And that can undermine your entire concept for your campaign or for your character, right? If your character's whole thing is, I'm a badass swordsman, and you horribly flub your badass swordsman role, and the GM describes you falling on your face or your sword breaking or whatever, it's a complete undermining of the narrative structure of your character. And so we get this tension, this like, but I want to win. I want to have my thing happen because I'm interested in that thing, and that's what my character's about. And it's hard when the rules tell you to fuck off, basically. So, okay, before we start talking about like general tools and stuff, let's talk about how some games try to do this already and how they might do it. And I'm thinking of one in particular. Because, we talk a lot about incentivizing player narration and incentivizing through the mechanics of a game certain types of play. So the example I think that often comes up is stunts, right? So stunts are a thing that Exalted, I'm sure they exist in other games, but my first example of them, first time I ever saw it, was in Exalted. So Exalted is a high fantasy manga, wuxia, Epic of Gilgamesh, kind of like Eastern fantasy game with a lot of other stuff that happens in it. But they want you, and I mean the designers, they want you to describe your character doing cool shit. So they award you two things for interesting narration. They give you dice so that you're more likely to succeed at stuff that is cool. And or they give you a reward in terms of a power refund. You get your essence points back or your willpower back if you describe things in a cool way. And a cool way is structured in that game as the least interesting way to describe a thing is I hit him, right? We're going to talk about combat. We'll use combat as an example. Like, I hit him. Okay, with what? My sword. I hit him with my sword. No dice for that, right? I draw my sword and hold it aloft, reflecting the light of the unconquered sun into his eyes, blinding him for a moment before I leap and attack with my sword. Okay, cool. You get a die. It's all GM fiat. The GM just gets to hand these stunt dice out according to the rules. And then if you incorporate the setting, if you incorporate the area, you talk about I run at him and leap forward, but throw myself to the side and kick off a pillar first so that I slash him. And when I land, the pillar topples down and crumbles onto him. Right? That gives you 2 points. And then 3 points is describing it in a really like everyone at the table stops and goes like, wow, that was amazing kind of way. And like, okay, that can work, but it can also lead to players angling for that shit, right? Like, this is the D&D 5e problem with inspiration as it's written, because inspiration, if you don't go for inspiration all the time, if you don't make every roll an inspired roll, you're falling behind mechanically on the game. So you end up having these like one-up contests where people are like, I have to describe a stunt, I gotta do a stunt. And so like what can turn a short combat scene, for example, into a very long and arduous one is when people are narrating not out of inspiration, lowercase I, but out of wanting that mechanical benefit. So it can undermine that structure. But I think the deeper problem with stunts as a mechanism is that, well, okay, let's talk about the order of operations. Let's talk about first in, last out, kind of like how a game processes input. Imagine a role-playing game as a machine, right? And the game has a microphone in which it absorbs our narration, our discussion of the game, our words, and it has a speaker, which is the rule book that tells us what happens when we describe things a certain way. Now, some games are closer to that model than others, but let's generally just assume that this machine operates on a basic logic. So what happens in this situation is the player describes their action, right? The action is described fictionally, and the GM responds by both simultaneously, according to the rules, setting the difficulty of the action, or sometimes the rules will, if it's something set, like attacking someone with a set amount of defense or hitting an armor class. So either the GM eyeballs it based on the description, or the rules say how difficult it is. The GM and the rules award dice, so you're turning the crank on the game machine and it's spitting out dice and difficulties. The player makes the roll. We look at whether success or failure occurs, as narrated by the GM. Now, the player loses control of everything that happens after they describe their action. So, in a way, this kind of game puts you into a situation in which you have to describe not a statement about your character, not I draw my sword and slash into him, shouting the name of my dead beloved. It's like I draw my sword and slash into him, shouting the name of my, what happens? Do I hit him? I don't know. Okay, describe the rest for me. Right? You lose this. It all kind of like jumbles and falls apart. And in the end, all that's really happening is the player is asking permission to do something cool. The game is giving them more likelihood that their permission is going to be granted. But it's problematic because the player is inclined to describe over-the-top shit to get these stunt dice. But if the GM is determining the difficulty, it's going to increase the difficulty as well. So you end up in this scaling factor where it's easier just to describe the most basic thing you're doing without embellishing it, because it's not going to be any harder. Like doing a triple backflip to get away from an enemy in the narration and adjudicating the difficulty of that triple backflip is going to be a lot harder than just jumping backwards or taking a step backwards, right? So the game hopefully has some degree of adjustment for that. But the trick here is that over-the-top actions incur both a higher chance for failure and sort of negate the bonus dice. And you could still fail and look like a total goof. And it sort of makes all of that initial narration kind of pointless. Nothing is more annoying than setting up a really cool description and having the rules tell you, like, get fucked. Like, you fall flat, nothing happens, you miss, next person, especially if you're an hour into that kung fu fight and the GM just really wants to get that shit over with. But we'll talk about combat pacing later. So, as a GM, you can change up that order of operations, right? Let's realign that a little bit. And in doing so, you stop turning the crank on the GM, game interaction machine, and you invite the player to be the one pressing the buttons and turning the crank, right? They can make their own sausage. So try it this way, right? Think about it like this. The player describes their intent, what their character wants, right? They want to hit their opponent with a sword, they want to cast a spell, they want to do a thing, right? You engage with what the player wants their character to have happen. The GM or the rules allocate the difficulty as usual. You roll the dice, and then you get cinematic, right? If the player succeeds, you tell them the parameters of their success. So like, you did 15 damage, which to you looks like a heavy wound, or you succeed, but just scratch him barely, or you give them parameters to work within, and then you allow the player to describe what that looks like. And you can do this in almost any game. This works best for mechanics-first games. Games that are not powered by the apocalypse. That's a special case. Talk about that in a second. But for this is like, I use this in Stars Without Number all the time, right? Where I'm like if you watched Titanfall, I was like, tell me how you kill your enemy, right? Tell me how you dealt 5 damage. Do the cinematic thing after the roll tells you what you're describing. Because otherwise you end up in that trap where it's a description that's a question, not an answer to the mechanic's suggestion. So that's something you can port into any game that is sort of focused on rolling the dice first and then narrating after. Then you can do this with failure too. You can be like, you miss. What does that look like, right? Because you trust your players not to try to narrate a non-mechanical event. Now, it's a little harder to do if your systems are fiction first, because in those systems you're relying on narrative to trigger the rules into action. And so if I were doing this in Dungeon World, I would just really lean on a specific GM rule for this. So I would allow the character action to be described up to the point of uncertainty, right till we hit that move trigger. So they describe what they're doing, and then you hit the moment where the rules say, whoop, my turn, I get to say something now. Dice are rolled, result is generated, the result parameters are established in the same way, so the GM narrates the result to the point where they hit that what do you do, but they can also ask you questions, right? Like, you take 5 damage as the orc bears down on you with his battle axe. What does that look like, right? How does your character respond? Ask questions, build in the answers, just GM the game as usual, but turn that narrative over to them in the moment, trusting that they understand the parameters of success or failure, and then just roll it into the next move and continue the fiction. It's a little looser this way, but you are still playing by the rules of the game. I think another thing that can really help you in this situation is setting expectations at the beginning. Talk about the kinds of things that inspire you for your game, and talk about the kinds of things you can do to make the action feel that way. Let your players know that this is the kind of game where like wire fu and gun kata are plausible, and narrating cool action sequences is going to get them smashed in the face with heavy difficulties, right? Let them know that in advance. Say, I'd like this game to feel cinematic, so feel free to describe your character doing backflips and all kinds of over-the-top stuff. Describe it like you're describing a kung fu fight. I won't penalize you for that. The other thing that you can do is, if you're playing a game in which you are adjudicating the difficulty of things, and the game isn't cinematic by nature, keep that in mind and think about how you can hack the difficulty to determine where penalties and the like come in. So if a game says, walking across a narrow bridge is DC 10, but running across a narrow bridge is DC 20, cut that rule. Just say narrow bridge, DC 10, right? It's going to make the characters will succeed more often doing things that don't penalize them, right? You want characters to be able to fight in the absolute darkness, throw away the blindness rules, right? Like you have pieces, components of these games. I'm looking at you, Pathfinder and D&D and variations thereof. Tweak those. Pull rules out, change how they work, modify some of the little mechanical stuff, because that's what's going to make the fiction of the game feel successful or not, depending on the actions that the players take. And look for places to incentivize the action that you want, right? Look at the reward structure of the game and find ways to impel players to behave a certain way. Keep in mind that this isn't just about action stuff either. You can apply this kind of tonal change to any shift in the table feel of a game. If you want to encourage a certain type of narrative, make sure your GM doesn't penalize that narrative by altering the rules of your game to make those actions easier or giving more control to the situations that match your cinematic nature of the game. Put that control in the hands of the players. You know, we can do anime and manga, but we can also do like soap operas and K-drama, right? Like you can emulate genres in a bunch of different ways by tweaking the kinds of mechanisms that are in the game, provided you're starting with the right sort of game. Players are going to go looking for opportunities to highlight their character's cool shit, right? Making that cool shit easier for them to do and encouraging exploration and narrative control around that is going to go a long way toward helping players feel comfortable getting on the cinema train with you, you know? If you entrust to your players some control over what it looks like and how it feels when their characters succeed or fail, you're going to get a lot more payback from that. So I hope that helps. I hope that your games are the right kind of action for you, and that's a thing that you can move towards. So our next question is about pacing. It's a very specific question about pacing and about how to end a certain kind of scene. So let's check it out.
I've played in a lot of narrative games where in an action scene, a GM keeps introducing complications until they feel the conflict is complete. For example, in John Harper's Danger Patrol. And I'm wondering how you decide there's enough narrative positioning to end the scene they're playing in, or say kill them off or remove player agency or whatever. Is it just a question of pacing and experience, or is there some mechanic you like to use? Thanks.
So the kind of core premise, the core premise of this question, I think, is that we're operating off the idea that the GM is the arbiter of when a scene is over. Now, that's not always the case, right? Like, we'll assume that in this case, we're looking at games in which that's a true statement, that the GM is the one who gets to say, okay, we're done with this scene. Here's the next scene. Rather than games that specifically tell you, like, as a group, when to end a scene. So, like, for example, if the game specifically says combat is over when no opposing characters are alive or within long range of any PC, combat ends when the rules say it ends, right? So look for that in the rules. Some games have it. Some games are not so good at giving you that information, which is fine, right? It's a priority to to the game. So if you're playing a game in which scene closure is part of the GM's responsibilities, it can be really daunting to know when to close a particular scene. Now, Golden here is asking about combat specifically, but ending a scene of any sort can feel a bit like a dictatorship of the game master if you're not comfortable, right? Being able to say like, bam, scene's over, that's scary, right? Because you're essentially saying, I feel like as a group we are done with this, ergo let's move the fuck on, right? Now, I mean, to ameliorate that a little bit, the first thing I'd advise you to do is ask your players, right? We've got a pretty good sense, I think, as GMs or players of a game, when a scene has kind of run its course. Like, you know that feeling? Like, think back to your most recent play of a tabletop game. Think about the last time you played an RPG. Now, there was probably a moment during a scene where everybody was kind of like, okay, nobody has anything else to say. Nobody has anything else to do. It kind of feels like as a group we're sort of done here. You know, you're starting to itch for that next cool thing. And so as a GM, if you start to feel that, say to your group, hey, like, it feels like this is kind of done, right? It feels like we're finished with this. How about somewhere else? How about we check that out, right? I've got some ideas about what might be the next thing. So think about that. Think about that feeling. And I think that because, and this is a lineage issue, but because tabletop role-playing games are built predominantly around combat and action, we get that happening in combat quite a lot. Like, how many times have you been playing Dungeons & Dragons? And if you've never played D&D, I'm sorry, this question may not apply to you, but try to think about it in terms of any game that has combat. But think about how many times you've been in a battle in Dungeons & Dragons, not like a real battle. I mean, maybe you've been in those too. But it's become patently obvious to you, or to everyone all at once, that the PCs have already won the fight, right? That it's done. The combat is over. But you're still doing that thing where you're just like hacking away at this one enemy that just won't die because you keep rolling badly. And it's just like, you gotta keep doing it because eventually, I don't know, maybe somebody will get crit and then you'll be dead. Like, you just want to like make sure that it's over. You've been in that situation. I've been in that situation. We've all played that game before. And it's funny because it's a bit of an asynchronous situation where PC lives or PC agency is at play, because we as GMs, we have an infinite number of NPCs, and if it takes them 10 minutes or 1 minute to kill the Iron Golem, fuck it, it doesn't matter. The Iron Golem's not relevant anymore. It's going to happen. You know, it's one thing to say as a GM, I think this fight is over. Y'all are kicking butt. Let's move to the end of the fight. Let's skip all that maybe a 1 in 1,000 chance that someone will die here, but let's just get it over with. Let's move on. But it's a whole other thing to say, well, they're obviously going to kill you, so let's just say you're all dead. Okay, new characters. Right? You need to be conscious of that, because in the latter case, it's more about saying, hey, so it feels to me like you're losing. Things seem pretty hopeless. Do you want to try to retreat? Should we do a chase scene? Are you going to surrender? Or do you really want to just like fight it out till you die? And if they're going to double down, if they're going to fight, then, you know, that's your players giving you feedback to say, no, we want to granularly blast our way through this. So, okay, that's a thing. You want to talk to the group about it. When you start to feel that, ask your players, hey, are you also feeling like you're not? It's like you're checking in, right? You're getting consent to continue, because it might be possible that you're all just as bored and sick of this crap, but no one's willing to say anything. So let's talk about mechanisms. I'm just going to focus on two. I know lots of games, and we'll give some examples later about games with framing and unframing mechanisms, but let's talk about two examples of games that try to mitigate combat length with mechanics. I'm going to give you a crap way to do it, in my opinion, and I'm sorry if this is a game that's your favorite, but whatever. I'll give you a crappy way and a way that is, in my opinion, a good way, okay? I'll give you a second to guess which ones I'm thinking of. Game mechanics, ending combat. All right, you got a guess? Got a guess in your mind? All right, we're gonna do the crap way first. So a game that does this in a crappy way is a game called 13th Age. So 13th Age, its combat situation is somewhere between 3rd edition and 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. It has a tendency to be kind of in a weird space between theater of the mind and very specific 5-foot step kind of combat. So there's this thing in 13th Age, and it's called the escalation die. Escalation die. It's essentially just a counter. You're counting up from 1, but use a die on the table. You rotate it, and it maxes out at 6. It's a 6-sided die. So here's how it works. So starting with the second round of combat, the escalation die gives a bonus to all PC attack rolls of 1. Then 2 on the next round, 3 on the round after that, 4, 5, until on the 7th round, all the players have a +6 bonus on their attack rolls. Now, if the players, there's specifically a paragraph in there, if the players are like turtling up and not actually engaging in combat, the GM's allowed to reset it back to 0. But I guess the idea here is to keep combat from going overly long. And it's a terrible mechanic in my mind because it feels like duct tape applied to a problem that's built into all the other places in the rules, right? It's like at a playtest, they were sitting there and they're like, this combat is getting boring. Wouldn't it be great if we all just had a +6 to hit for everything, right? Like, I get what they're doing. They're trying to fix a problem with that kind of combat and the dragginess of that combat, but it's also so inelegant and ham-fisted, right? It's like a punch in the face to any kind of design subtlety. And it doesn't actually have any bearing on the way combat feels in the narrative, right? Like, why is it that just the characters, not the monsters, just the characters get better at fighting as time goes on, but only within a window of 6 rounds? Like, I mean, I don't want to talk about realism because I think that's bullshit. But in my mind, there's no narrative of combat where you just get better and better and better as it goes on, right? Combat momentum in that way doesn't work like that. And so this is a way that a game has attempted to fix that problem, right? It's one pacing mechanism that, while it doesn't directly end the fight, attempts to solve this. We're all attacking the one monster that still has 25 AC, and we can't roll well enough just to fucking finish the fight and move on. You can bypass this kind of thing completely just by saying, hey, it feels like this fight is over. Right? Skip all that shit. So let's talk about a better way. Let's talk about a mechanic that I quite like, but puts a lot of pressure on the GM and the players to discuss and to engage in the fiction. And if you're scared of engaging the fiction, the game will also teach you to do that. So, okay, I'll give you a second. Think about it. What's a good game that has a pacing mechanism for combat that I like, that I think would work? It's Apocalypse World, obviously. So in Apocalypse World, we use these things called countdown clocks for everything. They're for how badly hurt you are. They're for the progression of threats. Basically, anything is built on a structure of momentum. And in battle, there's a way of tracking that momentum to say the fight is happening. Fights don't last forever. Make your moves now. Make them count. And that's how it goes. So the clock in this lets everyone know they have a limited amount of stuff they're going to get to do in a fight. Too often in a battle, we try to do everything. I want to kill the monsters. I want to protect the wizard. I don't want to let anyone get away. I want to maximize loot. And like the rest of Apocalypse World, this mechanism forces hard decisions. Do you want to kill the mutant chief, or do you want to make sure you don't get a machete to the face? Because you can't have both. Do you hide under the table, or do you get out there and take shots, right? Like, you have to make a hard decision. And it turns power over to the GM to say, okay, time's up, fight's over, right? Like, you have X amount of actions to do. Things happen, momentum builds, but the game calls the event at midnight. It says, all right, you're done. Who's winning, right? Like, by then, if after the countdown clock has reached midnight and you still can't figure out who's winning the fight, it wasn't really much of a fight to begin with. Or it's so deadlocked that that's the result, right? That nothing changed. Maybe some people were hurt and dead, but the new thing to deal with is you've all come to the realization you can't kill each other. But most of the time, you know who's going to win by the time you hit midnight, right? You look at the fiction and you say, as a group, with the GM having sort of final authority, what's the next thing, right? Who won this fight? And let's talk about the results. It limits battles to a set time, and it does something that I think is really admirable in that it hands the reins to the group. by way of the GM to decide when the next thing starts and what it is and where we see the player's character next, right? It can be tricky, and it requires an eye for momentum. You kind of have to be aware that the end is coming, but the more I use it, the more I like it. I wasn't totally sold on it until I played my most recent game of Apocalypse World. Like, I played the Roll20 Presents the Waterworld kind of game we did, and there were several like boat battles that I felt were really decisive because of that. Now, these are explicit mechanisms. Things like hit points in Dungeons and Dragons, wounds in Burning Wheel, those are all a form of very terminal, very binary countdown for combat. So look at the mechanisms of the game that you're playing and try to stick to those rules, but consider that whenever a scene in a game, whatever game you're playing, starts to feel dull or stale or just like done, or the outcome just becomes obvious, it's not going to miraculously change direction and suddenly become fun. So ask the other players, are we done with this shit? Because I feel done. And if the players are like, no, we're having so much fun, try to buy into their excitement. Try to buy back in, because you know, it's a thing that not all games handle well, and sometimes you have to, as a group, communicate your feelings about those things. Scenes, ending scenes, can be complicated. Speaking of scenes and maybe the flip side of that, let's talk about, this is great. I love this question because Alex's text version of the question, compare and contrast.
Hi Adam, I'm Alex, better known by my super secret pseudonym, Fake Alex Blue. I'll keep this question short because I'm aware that most conversations with me should probably have a warning sign posted at their borders that reads, "Abandon all hope of brevity, ye who enter here," but, you know, I'll try and be considerate. So, while I'm not exactly a new GM, I am back behind the screen again after some years away, and it seems like maybe this wasn't so much of an issue when I was first cutting my teeth. My question is, how do I do magic? No, I mean, how do I get better at scene framing? I'll admit that sometimes scenes I've framed fall flat, or they plod tediously, just going through the motions. How do I adjust the pacing to keep our conversation interesting? And how do I cut to the chase and set the stakes to hook in interest, without eliding the other player's chances of offering up something that perhaps I didn't expect and therefore gleefully skipped over? Your thoughts, as always, would be much appreciated.
Well, Alex, scene framing. So let's start by talking about what scene framing is. Now, I know all y'all are in the know, but if you're not, then let's talk about how this works as a discipline. So when we talk about scene framing, it's a thing you're already doing if you're GMing, right? Every GM does this already. Some forward-thinking players, they do this too. But some GMs do it with a lot of intention. Most do it by accident without realizing they're doing it. It's the GM move of saying, this is where you are, this is who else is there, this is what's going on. It's pretty much the main thing that any given GM is doing at any given moment throughout a game. Framing is specifically about the beginning of that discipline, but you can think about it as applying to any time you are setting the stage for your characters. And now, good scene framing involves establishing things, but also inviting input, inviting response, right? So most games, I think, take scene framing for granted or just don't talk about it at all. Even if their games involve it and you ask them, hey, how does your game handle scene framing? They might not be able to answer that question because most games don't acknowledge that it's a thing. It's just part of GMing. When we talk about scene framing, we mean, okay, so this is how I would like frame a scene, right? So the opening credits fade, and we see a long establishing shot of the Caberlet's cityscape at dawn. There are silvery, nano-forged towers jutting up out of the fog, glistening in the early light. And as we pan down, we see, by sharp contrast to its environment, the battered hull of the intrepid Swan Song sitting dirtily on the china-white surface of a landing pad, like a rotten lump of meat on a beautiful plate. The crew emerges from the ship, accompanied by a member of the Caberlet's Special Police dressed in the crisp blue uniform that holds their authority. The crew is arguing, it seems, with this police officer. And as we get closer, as we pan into the shot, we hear, "Captain Higgins, this simply will not stand." And that's scene framing, right? Like you've framed a scene, and now you're able to say, what do you do, right? You're doing a combination of answering questions for your players. You're giving them the answer to what is on my palette, right? What can I use to describe, what can I do to highlight my cool thing, right? To go back to what I was saying to Dave earlier on, it's about giving them the colors to paint with. This is where the 2-die stunt comes in, right? Like you can't describe in a vacuum. So that's a responsibility of the GM, to frame in a way that provides context for the character's existence and their motivations. You're giving them fuel to ignite the creative part of their brain and to give them things to work with for their character sheets and their funny voices and their ideas in their head. It's an important discipline to practice and to be good at, because if you do it badly, the players, like if you just say you're in a city and I don't know, there's like a cop there and he's all mad at you because of you didn't do your papers. Well, what? I mean, what do you say to the cop? Like, he's mad and stuff. Yeah, no. Yeah, definitely. He's pissed. Right? Like, you can frame scenes, and I'm not saying every scene you need to spend 20 minutes framing, but I'm just saying, like, be evocative. A good scene, the framing of a scene should tell you where the characters are, what of interest is present, who is there to interact with, and most importantly, what is happening right now. Don't frame a scene in which nothing's happening. It's boring as hell, right? You really need to be able to say, this is a thing. Deal with it. It doesn't have to be like, the cop has his gun out and he's going to shoot you in your face because you didn't do your paperwork. But it can be like, there's a tension, there's a vibe, there's a feeling, there's a sense in the moment of something about to happen. And then you give it to the players and you say, go, light that fuse. Let's see what happens. The thing to remember here, and this is something that I've come to learn like so dramatically over time, is that good scene framing it's not for the players. Or it's not for the characters, or just for the players. It's for all of you. So think about this. Like, you're not describing the location to the characters. You're not describing it to just the players' characters. You're describing it to the players to give them context for the scene. Now, this can be tricky because it relies on the players acting in character and focusing on that stuff. But like the core thing here is that you want to mention things that will catch their attention, things that will delight them and you about that moment, and you want to share those things with the players. You're going to feed them ingredients so that they can cook up the scene to come. And you want to be comfortable giving them details that are inspiring, but maybe not immediately obvious. Or go with things, and this is something that I know a lot of kind of modern designers or GMs will agree with, in that sometimes the best thing to do is to tell your players something the characters don't know. Right? Okay, so like here's an example. Compare and contrast, right? So you have this NPC in the room. There's an NPC, and he knows some information that you want to know. And he's sitting at the table, and you're all surrounding him. And one of you has your knife on the table, and you're all glaring at him, and you're trying to scare him. And he's just sitting there, and he's stone-faced, right? And he says, I don't know anything. What do you do? Right? So you can do that. That's a thing you can do. Because it's going to prompt, okay, well, we utilize our skills. I'm going to roll Intimidate. I'm going to try to, like, yank some information out of him. But you can also say... your killer is in the room, You can see sweat dripping down his forehead because he's already lied to you 3 or 4 times. You know he's guilty. It's written all over his face. Right? You can impart that information directly to your players and then watch them struggle with that, right? And do the same thing. Do that with the characters that are present. Give them details about the scene that they're in that are interesting to the player that they could incorporate. And give them details that allow them to explore how their character finds that out. Apocalypse World suggests this, and I've definitely seen it in other games, where instead of forcing all these, like, is he lying to me checks, just tell them. You know? If a player's like, did you kill him? The NPC says, no, of course not. You can say, yeah, he totally did. Like, he's lying to your face. So think about the things that aren't immediately obvious, incorporate those into your scene, and follow your passion, right? Frame scenes from a place in your mind and heart of excitement and wonder. Answer questions, but posit what might happen next, what could happen here, because players are a lit match, and all your scene is to them is gasoline-soaked TNT factories, right? You want it to explode. You want them to blow that scene up. Sometimes literally, but whatever it looks like, you want to give them fuel so they can burn as brightly and as hotly as possible. And as far as missing out on, because Alex asked about sort of steamrolling the players' thoughts or steamrolling what they might have as a priority, avoiding that, you basically have 2 options, right? You can take your role as the GM to heart. Right? Like, you're given this authority by the game to set the scene and trust that the game is designed well, and what you think is interesting to start a scene is valid and real, and it's part of your job to recognize and know that, and to know your players and to incorporate their feelings into that, and to read the vibe at the table and just do it. Just open the scene, set the stage, and it's okay not to have the players give you involvement in everything you do. You're the GM. Right? Do the thing. Now, of course, between sessions and as people on a lateral playing field, a non-hierarchical game space outside the Ludo narrative, you can ask after the game, like, hey, did you like the way I framed those scenes? Was it too intense? Was it too slow? Like, I would like some feedback as a person trying to perfect my craft of being a GM, and hopefully your players will give you that feedback. Do that also, right? Treat them like people and take their feedback on this artistic endeavor you're all a part of. But also it's your job, right? The drummer in the band doesn't stop midway through a fill to ask the bass player if they're hitting the cymbal enough times. They do it, and then you workshop for the next time you play the song, right? The other option that you can take, and I don't want these to be presented as 2 binary options, because we don't like binary options here. The second option, and feel free to Venn diagram these however you like. The second option is create a safe space for interjection, right? This is the more sort of live tennis match version of this. Don't just take a deep breath. Don't just box text, right? Take pauses. Sip your tea mid-paragraph. Take a breath. Give your players the space to say, oh, that's interesting, but what if in the background we can see a group of dark elves standing looking dourly at us while we speak to the prince? That's the player signaling to you, hey, what if dark elf? What if they witness this conversation? That's the thing I would like to have incorporated. Now, the players are already doing this by the choices they made on their character sheet, right? Don't ignore when you're framing the scene the characters in that scene. Think about the things that they care about as a flag of player priority and yank that in. But give your players a chance to ask what if you've missed something. And they'll help you frame that scene, but keep a firm hand on that rudder, right? We've talked about loss of creative oversight before. We've talked about games that can't handle the bending of the GM authority model. I mean, unless the game says otherwise, it's your job. You're the scene framer, so do it. You can get help, but do it. And as you invite your players to contribute and as you teach them the ways in which you want them to contribute, they'll do it more eagerly on their own. Ultimately, this is the sort of it's a soft rule, that we tend to forget about. It's a responsibility of the GM that, frankly, most games don't address. So we fall back on the things we know about role-playing games, right? If you look at any of the conversations that happened around Apocalypse World, which codifies the GM's role very strictly, if you look at a lot of the conversations that happened on, say, like N-World or RPG.net around when that game came out, people's feedback, especially experienced game masters, and I say that sarcastically because these people are people who are very stolid in their ways. Experienced game masters looked at Apocalypse World and says, why do I need this chapter? I know how to GM. I GM already. I do all this stuff, right? This is the thing that I don't need to learn about, or I don't need you as a game to tell me this thing. So I think you want to look at the rules for context about what we're taught by the game and what we aren't. Now, if you want to get better at this, there are a lot of games that are going to help you learn more about framing scenes. They all kind of come from the same period of tabletop game design. Primetime Adventures, Polaris, Dogs in the Vineyard, Danger Patrol, and of course, like the sort of universal standard for this is Fiasco, right? Fiasco is a game in which the roles for scene framing are boiled in. So play that game. Play all these games. Play all the games. Play every game you can get your hands on. But for scene framing, that's a good place to start. I think the other thing that you can do is learn the ways that you prefer to frame scenes. Find out what excites you about that, and then make sure that you're giving the players something to react to, right? Build up your excitement, hand it off to the players, and then start that tennis match. Because if you do that, it's going to build a space that gets things up and running right out the gate. So yeah. That's my opinion about scene framing. It's a discipline, and it's something that with practice and with confidence you'll learn to get better at. And that's just kind of how it goes. So hopefully, I mean, these are some really interesting questions and kind of some graduate level stuff. Like if you're thinking about scene framing, you're already taking a step kind of beyond what we've talked about a little bit on the channel and in this space. And so I hope that it's something that in the course of the show and with some additional practice, you'll be able to feel yourself improving at. I have faith in you, all of you. So that'll be it for today. Office hours, of course, always, my door is always open. If you want to get involved in the show, you want to ask me questions, go to www.adam-koble.com/office-hours. Or just go to my website, click the office hours link, and you too can submit your question. Now, I've got a significant backlog of questions. We're getting through them 1 week at a time. So if it looks like it's taking a little while for me to get to you, please be patient. We've also got some stuff coming up for the office hours space. I'm going to keep doing it on Twitch. We're going to keep posting it on YouTube. But in a few weeks, I will put up the first 10 episodes as a podcast. I've got some cool intro music by Drummer Boy, and I'm really looking forward to trying out a different venue for my advice. So thanks for coming, everybody, and we will see you on the next office hours.